Millionaire invited his ex to his wedding to see her suffer, but she showed up with his triplets. Welcome to Tales After Dark. Before starting, please get comfortable. Please like and subscribe so we can keep giving you our stories. Let's get started. Edward Langston was the embodiment of a self-made man. Born in a working-class neighborhood, he spent his early years dreaming of a life far removed from the modest one he knew. Edward's childhood was filled with challenges. His father worked long hours in a factory, while his mother juggled multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. Their struggles planted a seed of ambition in Edward, who swore he would rise above his circumstances. Fueled by determination, he excelled academically and secured a scholarship to a prestigious university, where his natural intellect and unrelenting drive set him apart. It was there, amidst the pressure of deadlines and the promise of a brighter future, that he met Clara Matthews. Clara was everything Edward wasn't. While Edward was fiercely pragmatic and hyper-focused on success, Clara was a dreamer, an artist who saw beauty in life's imperfections. The two connected during a chance encounter at a campus art exhibit, where Clara's work caught Edward's attention. Her paintings spoke of resilience, hope, and the human spirit, qualities Edward admired but didn't believe he possessed. They quickly fell in love, their contrasting personalities creating a magnetic bond. Clara grounded Edward, offering him comfort and perspective during the most stressful periods of his academic career. For her, Edward was a source of stability and inspiration, a partner who encouraged her to chase her artistic dreams. As Edward graduated and transitioned into the professional world, their relationship deepened. Clara was his anchor, supporting him emotionally and financially during the early days of his entrepreneurial journey. Edward's tech startup, an ambitious project aimed at revolutionizing e-commerce, required long hours and significant sacrifices. Clara believed in Edward's vision, often working extra shifts at her part-time job to help him fund his dream. Their tiny apartment became both a home and an office, filled with whiteboards covering Edward's ideas and sketches of Clara's art. Despite the chaos, they shared a vision of the future, one where they would build a life together, blending their passions and successes. However, as Edward's startup began to gain traction, cracks started to form in their relationship. Success brought new challenges and opportunities, and Edward's focus shifted entirely to his work. Long nights turned into weeks spent away at networking events and meetings with investors, leaving Clara feeling increasingly sidelined. She missed the man who used to listen to her ideas and dream with her about the future. Edward, on the other hand, began to see their relationship as a distraction. He resented Clara's attempts to pull him away from work, misinterpreting her concerns as a lack of support for his ambitions. Their arguments became more frequent, each one chipping away at the bond they had once shared. The breaking point came during a heated argument about their future. Clara, frustrated by Edward's emotional distance, accused him of caring more about money than their relationship. Edward, defensive and exhausted, lashed out, claiming that Clara was holding him back from achieving greatness. The words hung heavy in the air, marking the end of their relationship. Clara left, heartbroken and disillusioned, while Edward buried himself deeper in his work, convincing himself that success would fill the void she left behind. Edward's gamble paid off. Within a few years, his company became a household name, and he transformed from an ambitious entrepreneur into a multimillionaire. His face graced magazine covers, and his name was synonymous with success. But along with his wealth came a new identity, one that Edward carefully curated. He surrounded himself with glamorous people, hosted extravagant parties, and dated women who fit the image of his newfound status. He told himself he was happier this way, that he had moved on from his past. Clara became a distant memory, a chapter in his life he seldom revisited. Meanwhile, Clara's life took an unexpected turn. Shortly after their breakup, she discovered she was pregnant, a reality she faced alone. The news was bittersweet. While she was overjoyed at the thought of becoming a mother, the circumstances were far from ideal. Clara knew Edward would be unwilling to give up his ambitions for a family, and she decided not to tell him. She was determined to raise her children on her own, relying on the resilience and independence she had cultivated throughout her life. When she gave birth to triplets, Clara's world changed forever. Her days became a whirlwind of diapers, feedings, and late-night cries, But amidst the chaos, she found a profound sense of purpose. Raising 3 children on her own was no easy feat. Clara worked multiple jobs, often sacrificing her own dreams to ensure her children had everything they needed. Despite the challenges, she never let bitterness consume her. She channeled her pain into her art, creating pieces that resonated with audiences and eventually gained her modest recognition in the local art community. Her children grew up in a loving home, unaware of the man who had walked away from their mother's life. Clara told herself she didn't need Edward, and for the most part, she believed it. Her children were her world, and their happiness was all that mattered. Years later, a gilded envelope arrived at Clara's doorstep. The invitation was addressed in elegant script, inviting her to the wedding of Edward Langston and Veronica St. James. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words, a mix of emotions flooding her heart. The memories she had buried long ago resurfaced, bringing with them a pang of sadness and anger. The audacity of Edward's invitation was clear. This wasn't an act of kindness or reconciliation. It was a calculated move, a way for him to flaunt his success and remind her of what she had lost. Clara debated whether to attend, knowing the emotional toll it would take. But as she looked at her children, now vibrant and full of life, she felt a surge of determination. Edward might have moved on, but he deserved to know the truth about the life he had abandoned. The invitation marked the beginning of a journey Clara never expected to take. She wasn't the same woman Edward had left behind. She was stronger, wiser, unafraid to face the man who had once broken her heart. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only challenge Edward's carefully curated narrative, but also reveal the strength and resilience of a woman who had risen above her circumstances. Little did Edward know that his wedding day would become the most pivotal moment of his life, a moment that would force him to confront the choices he had made and the consequences they carried. The glittering wedding of Edward Langston and Veronica St. James was set to be the social event of the year. With a guest list featuring tech industry giants, celebrities, and politicians, the wedding was Edward's opportunity to showcase his ascent to the pinnacle of wealth and success. It was to be held at an opulent estate just outside the city, a sprawling property with lush gardens, crystal chandeliers, and a banquet hall large enough to host hundreds. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the designer invitations to the imported floral arrangements. Edward wanted perfection, not just for his bride-to-be, but for his image. This wedding wasn't merely a union of love. It was a symbol of everything Edward had achieved. Among the hundreds of invitations sent was one with Clara Matthews' name etched in bold, elegant lettering. Edward had hesitated briefly before including her on the list, but his desire to assert his triumph outweighed any lingering doubts. The idea of Clara witnessing his success was intoxicating. He imagined her walking into the grandeur of his wedding, dressed plainly and looking out of place, her expression betraying regret as she saw the life she could have been part of. Edward didn't just want to flaunt his wealth, he wanted to make a point. To him, inviting Clara was the ultimate power move, a chance to rewrite history in his favor and erase any doubts about the choices he had made. Clara, however, had long since stopped seeing Edward as the center of her world. The invitation arrived on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, interrupting the hum of daily life in her modest but cozy home. At first, Clara didn't believe her eyes. She read and reread the gilded card, the words, "Edward Langston and Veronica St. James cordially invite you." Blurring as a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. Memories of their relationship, their love, and its bitter end resurfaced, mingled with the years of struggle and growth that had followed. Clara's initial reaction was disbelief. Why would Edward, after all these years, invite her to his wedding? Was it a genuine gesture of closure or something more calculated? As the reality of the invitation sank in, Clara felt a pang of anger. She recognized the intent behind Edward's gesture. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was a display of power, a way to remind her of his success and her perceived failure. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring the invitation, tossing it into the trash and continuing with her life. But then she thought of her children. They had grown up without knowing their father, and while Clara had done her best to shield them from the bitterness of her past, she couldn't deny that they had questions. They deserved to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the man who had once caused her so much pain. The days that followed were filled with contemplation. Clara oscillated between anger, sadness, and curiosity. Part of her wanted to stay away, to avoid reopening old wounds. But another part of her, the part that had fought tirelessly to provide for her children, wanted to confront Edward, to show him the life he had missed. She imagined walking into his wedding, not as the broken woman he expected, but as a proud mother who had built a beautiful life for herself and her children. Clara wasn't seeking revenge, but she did want Edward to see the truth. He had moved on, but so had she, and her story was one of resilience and strength. When Clara finally decided to attend the wedding, she knew she couldn't go alone. Her triplets, now 5 years old, were the heart of her life, and their presence would speak louder than any words she could say. Clara didn't want to cause a scene, but she also wasn't going to hide the truth. Her children had the right to meet their father, even if it happened under the most unexpected circumstances. Over the next few weeks, Clara prepared for the wedding with a mix of nerves and determination. She chose an elegant but understated dress, one that reflected her confidence and grace without overshadowing the event. She explained the situation to her children in the simplest terms, emphasizing that they were going to meet an old friend. The triplets, excited by the idea of attending a fancy party, were blissfully unaware of the emotional stakes. As the wedding day approached, Edward was blissfully unaware of what was coming. He had spent months planning every detail of the event, confident that it would be a flawless celebration of his success. Veronica, his bride-to-be, was equally invested in the spectacle. She relished the idea of marrying one of the most successful men in the country, basking in the attention and admiration their union would bring. Together, they represented everything Edward believed he had achieved: wealth, power, and status. Clara was a distant memory, a relic of a life he had left behind. In Edward's mind, her attendance at the wedding would only serve to highlight his triumph, a reminder of how far he had come. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the estate bathed in golden sunlight. Guests began to arrive, their designer outfits and luxury cars adding to the atmosphere of opulence. Inside, Edward was preparing for the ceremony, his thoughts occasionally drifting to Clara. He imagined her reaction as she stepped into the grand hall, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Edward's confidence was unshakable until he saw her. When Clara arrived, the room seemed to pause. Dressed in a simple but elegant gown, she exuded a quiet strength that immediately commanded attention. But it wasn't just Clara who turned heads. Walking beside her were 3 identical children, their bright eyes and infectious smiles lighting up the room. They held Clara's hands as they walked through the entrance, their presence an undeniable statement. Conversations stopped, and whispers spread like wildfire among the guests. Who were these children? And why do they look so much like Edward? Edward's carefully constructed world began to tremble. He hadn't anticipated this. The sight of Clara with 3 children, a striking resemblance to himself written all over their faces, was a revelation he wasn't prepared for. The moment Clara stepped into the room, the dynamic shifted. This wasn't the narrative Edward had planned. Clara wasn't there to admire his success or lament her supposed losses. She was there to tell a story Edward hadn't expected, one that would change the course of the day and his life forever. The grand estate was a sight to behold on Edward Langston's wedding day. Its sprawling grounds were meticulously decorated, with every detail reflecting the wealth and prestige Edward had built his life around. The gardens overflowed with rare, exotic flowers flown in from around the world. Crystal chandeliers hung from towering tents, casting a warm, golden glow on the meticulously arranged tables set with fine china and silverware. A live orchestra played a symphony of classical pieces, adding a touch of elegance to the already opulent atmosphere. Guests arrived in droves, stepping out of luxury cars and into the carefully curated world Edward had created to celebrate his union with Veronica St. James. For Edward, everything was perfect, or so it seemed. Inside the bridal suite, Veronica was the epitome of sophistication. Dressed in a custom-made gown adorned with pearls and diamonds, she radiated confidence. The daughter of a powerful real estate magnate, Veronica had been raised in wealth and privilege, making her the perfect partner for Edward in his pursuit of societal prominence. She reveled in the spectacle, the attention, and the idea of being married to one of the most successful men in the country. As her bridal party fussed over final touches, Veronica smiled at her reflection, knowing the day would be one to remember. Meanwhile, Edward stood in a private room, adjusting his tie as he prepared for the biggest moment of his life. He was proud of what he had accomplished, proud of the life he had built. Today wasn't just about love. It was about cementing his legacy. As he glanced at himself in the mirror, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Everything had fallen into place, just as he had envisioned. He thought briefly of Clara Matthews and how different his life would have been if he had stayed with her. In his mind, inviting Clara had been a calculated decision. He pictured her arriving quietly, perhaps with a polite smile, blending into the crowd and fading into the background. Edward had no idea how wrong he was. Clara, on the other hand, approached the day with a mix of apprehension and resolve. She had carefully prepared her children, ensuring they were dressed in matching formal outfits that complemented her own elegant attire. The triplets were excited about the big party, blissfully unaware of the emotional undercurrents. As she drove to the estate, Clara couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come since her days with Edward. She wasn't the timid, hopeful young woman she had been back then. She was a mother, an artist, and a woman who had carved out a life of her own despite the odds. Her heart raced as she approached the estate gates, the grandeur of the event confirming Edward's intent to flaunt his success. But Clara wasn't here to feel small. She was here to remind Edward of the truths he had long ignored. The scene at the entrance was nothing short of dramatic. Clara stepped out of her modest car, holding the hands of her 3 children. As they walked toward the venue, heads turned, and whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Her arrival was unexpected, not because of who she was, but because of who was with her. The triplets, with their striking resemblance to Edward, drew immediate attention. Their bright eyes, sharp features, and even their mannerisms mirrored the man everyone was here to celebrate. It was as if Edward's past had walked into the future he had so carefully constructed, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Inside the venue, the buzz grew louder as word spread about Clara's arrival. Guests speculated about her identity, her connection to Edward, and most intriguingly, the children at her side. By the time Clara and the triplets entered the grand hall, all eyes were on them. The orchestra faltered for a moment, the music dipping as even the musicians turned to see what had caused the commotion. Clara, undeterred by the attention, held her head high. She walked with a quiet confidence, her children flanking her like a small army. The triplets, oblivious to the stares, marveled at the beauty of the decorations, their excitement a stark contrast to the tension that filled the room. Edward, standing near the front of the hall, felt his chest tighten as he caught sight of Clara. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. She looked different, stronger, more radiant, more self-assured. But it wasn't just Clara that caught his attention. His gaze fell to the 3 children beside her, and time seemed to slow. The resemblance was undeniable. It was like looking at a reflection of himself, split into 3 smaller versions. Edward's carefully composed demeanor faltered, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. These weren't just Clara's children, they were his. The room, sensing the shift in energy, seemed to collectively hold its breath. Veronica, standing nearby and chatting with guests, noticed Edward's expression and followed his gaze. Her smile froze as her eyes landed on Clara and the triplets. Confusion and disbelief flickered across her face as she turned to Edward for an explanation. Edward, for the first time in years, was at a loss for words. Clara approached slowly, her steps deliberate and measured. The whispers grew louder, the guests unable to contain their curiosity. Who was this woman? And what connection did she have to Edward? As Clara and her children reached the center of the room, she stopped and looked directly at Edward. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the past, the choices they had made, and the years that had passed hung heavy in the air. Edward, caught between shock and shame, struggled to process the situation. Clara, calm but resolute, broke the silence with a simple greeting. "Hello, Edward," she said, her voice steady. "It's been a long time." The triplets, sensing the tension, clung to her hands, their wide eyes taking in the grandeur of the room. Veronica, now visibly unsettled, stepped closer to Edward and whispered something inaudible. Edward barely registered her words, his focus entirely on Clara and the children. The room seemed to shrink as he realized the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just a disruption to his wedding. It was a confrontation with a truth he had long ignored. Clara's presence, and the presence of their children, was a reminder of the life he had left behind in his pursuit of success. Edward's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble, and the day he had envisioned as the pinnacle of his achievements was quickly becoming something entirely different. The grand hall, once abuzz with lively chatter and the harmonious sound of the orchestra, had fallen into a tense, deafening silence. All eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding at the center of the room. Clara Matthews standing tall with her 3 children beside her, facing Edward Langston. The guests, who had gathered to celebrate Edward's marriage to Veronica St. James, now found themselves spectators to a drama that none of them had anticipated. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like an electric current, as the striking resemblance between the triplets and Edward became the unspoken but undeniable truth. Edward stood frozen, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. His once calm and composed demeanor was replaced with visible confusion and unease. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and everything he thought he knew about his life was suddenly in question. Clara's arrival had not only disrupted the carefully orchestrated event, but it also forced Edward to confront a truth he had never considered. These children, her children, were his. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him unsteady and struggling to regain control of his thoughts. Veronica, who had been standing at Edward's side moments ago, now looked at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Her perfectly curated smile had faded, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that betrayed her growing anxiety. "Edward," she whispered sharply, pulling him slightly to the side. "Who is she? And who are those children?" Her tone, while hushed, carried an edge that hinted at the storm brewing within her. Edward, however, couldn't find the words to answer. How could he explain something he himself didn't fully understand? Clara, sensing the weight of the moment, decided to speak. She hadn't come to the wedding to cause a scene, but she also wasn't going to let Edward evade the truth. Her voice, calm but firm, cut through the silence. "Edward," she began, her gaze unwavering. "These are your children. Meet James, Amelia, and Theo." Each name was spoken with pride and conviction, as if to solidify their presence in a room that had long ignored their existence. The triplets, sensing the shift in their mother's tone, looked up at Edward with curious eyes, their innocence contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. The revelation was like a bomb detonating in the middle of the hall. Gasps echoed from the crowd, and the whispers grew louder. Guests exchanged incredulous looks, some leaning toward their neighbors to confirm what they had just heard. "His children," one woman murmured, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you know he had kids?" Another guest whispered to her companion. The realization that Edward, the groom, had 3 children no one had known about sent shockwaves through the room, appending the carefully crafted image of the man everyone thought they knew. Edward's chest tightened as he looked at the 3 small faces staring back at him. There was no denying it, they were his. James had his sharp jawline, Amelia had his piercing eyes, and Theo shared his determined expression. It was as though fate had carved pieces of Edward into each of them, leaving no room for doubt. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, Edward struggled to accept the truth. His life had been meticulously planned, every decision made to ensure his success. The existence of these children, hidden from him for so many years, threatened to unravel everything. "What were you talking about?" Edward finally stammered, his voice unsteady. This can't be true." He turned to Clara, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Why didn't you tell me? Why now?" His questions, while valid, carried a defensive tone that only fueled Clara's resolve. She had anticipated his reaction and had prepared herself for it. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze with unwavering determination. "I didn't tell you because you left, Edward," Clara replied, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You made it clear that your ambitions were more important than anything else. I found out I was pregnant after we broke up, and by then it was too late. You were already gone, chasing your dreams." Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the choices Edward had made and the consequences he had ignored. Clara's tone softened slightly as she continued. "I raised them on my own, and I've never once regretted it. But they deserve to know their father, and you deserve to know them." Edward's mind reeled as he processed Clara's words. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unrelenting, as he realized the weight of what he had missed. The milestones he had never witnessed, the moments he would never get back. They all flashed before him like a slideshow of regret. But even as guilt gnawed at him, another emotion began to surface. Anger. Anger at Clara for keeping the truth from him, anger at himself for the choices he had made, and anger at the situation that had unfolded so publicly. Veronica, meanwhile, was seething. She had stood silently, watching the exchange with growing disbelief and fury. Turning to Edward, she demanded answers. "Is this true, Edward? Are they really your children?" Her voice, though controlled, carried a sharp edge that left no room for evasion. Edward, caught between the past and the present, could only nod. The admission, though unspoken, was clear in his expression. Veronica's face twisted in a mixture of rage and betrayal. This was supposed to be her day, her moment, and now it was being overshadowed by a revelation she hadn't seen coming. The guests, now fully engrossed in the drama, watched as the scene unfolded. Some whispered in hushed tones, speculating about the fallout, while others simply stared, unable to look away. Edward, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment, felt the walls closing in around him. His perfect day had turned into a nightmare, and there was no escaping the truth that Clara had brought with her. Clara, however, remained composed. She hadn't come to humiliate Edward or ruin his wedding. Her goal was simple, to ensure that her children knew their father, and that Edward faced the truth of his past. Looking at him now, she saw a man who was no longer the confident, ambitious figure she had once loved. Instead, he was vulnerable, exposed, and grappling with a reality he had spent years avoiding. Clara felt a mixture of vindication and sadness, knowing that this moment, though necessary, was as painful for Edward as it was for her. As the tension in the room reached its peak, the triplets tugged gently at Clara's hands, their innocent voices breaking the silence. "Mommy," James said softly, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Is he our daddy?" The question, spoken with such simplicity, shattered whatever defenses Edward had left. He looked down at the children, their hopeful faces a stark reminder of the love and innocence he had overlooked in his pursuit of success. For the first time in years, Edward felt the weight of his choices, and he realized that no amount of wealth or status could fill the void left by the family he had abandoned. The grand hall remained eerily silent, the air thick with tension as Edward Langston stood before the truth he had so long ignored. Clara's words echoed in his mind, each one slicing through the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life. His triplets, James, Amelia, and Theo, stood beside her, their innocent expressions in stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within him. Around them, the wedding guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay and watch or leave the room entirely. The event that had begun as a celebration of Edward's success and love had transformed into an unanticipated confrontation that no one had expected. Veronica St. James, Edward's fiancée, was the first to break the silence. Her face was a mixture of anger, confusion, and humiliation as she turned to Edward, demanding answers in a voice that carried through the hall. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her tone sharp and cutting. "Edward, tell me this isn't true." But the look in Edward's eyes gave her the answer she dreaded. He was unable to speak, his throat dry and his mind reeling. Veronica's carefully composed demeanor began to crumble as she realized the magnitude of the situation. Her perfect wedding, the day she had dreamed of for months, was unraveling in front of hundreds of witnesses. Edward, still reeling from the revelation, struggled to regain control of the situation. His instincts told him to deny, to deflect, to salvage what remained of his image. But as he looked at the three small faces staring back at him, he knew there was no denying the truth. These were his children, and their existence was no longer a secret he could avoid. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Clara, his voice trembling with a mix of guilt and frustration. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge of accusation. Clara, who had anticipated Edward's reaction, stood her ground. "You left, Edward," she replied firmly. "You made it clear that your ambitions were more important than anything else. When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone, building your empire, chasing your dreams. I didn't tell you, because I didn't think you wanted to know." Her voice softened slightly as she glanced at her children. "But they deserve to know who their father is, and you deserve to know them. That's why I'm here." Veronica's patience, already stretched thin, finally snapped. "So you kept this from him for years, and now you decide to show up on our wedding day to drop this bombshell," she spat, her words laced with venom. Clara met Veronica's glare with a calm but resolute expression. "This isn't about you," she said, her tone unwavering. "This is about my children and their right to know their father. I didn't come here to ruin your wedding. I came here because the truth needed to come out, no matter how inconvenient it might be." The guests, who had been murmuring among themselves, now openly speculated about the unfolding drama. Some whispered about Clara's strength and grace in the face of adversity, while others questioned Edward's character and the choices that had led to this moment. The ripple effect of the revelation was palpable, spreading through the crowd and leaving no one untouched. Edward's colleagues and business associates exchanged knowing glances, silently reassessing the man they had once admired. Friends of Veronica whispered in hushed tones, their sympathies lying squarely with the humiliated bride-to-be. As the tension escalated, Edward realized he needed to act. The weight of the situation was suffocating, and the scrutiny from the guests was unbearable. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Clara and the children. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Clara nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. She glanced down at her children and smiled reassuringly. "Why don't you three go sit over there for a little while?" she suggested, pointing to a quieter corner of the hall. The triplets, sensing the seriousness of the situation, obeyed without question, their small hands gripping one another for comfort. Edward led Clara to a side room, away from the prying eyes of the guests. Veronica, torn between anger and curiosity, hesitated for a moment before following them. The three of them stood in a room, the air thick with unresolved emotions. Edward looked at Clara, his face etched with regret. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted. "I didn't know. I didn't even consider." Clara interrupted gently but firmly. "I didn't come here to punish you, Edward. I came here because our children deserve better. They deserve to know their father, and you deserve the chance to be part of their lives, if you're willing." Her words carried a note of forgiveness, but also a challenge. This wasn't about Edward's ego or his reputation. It was about the children who had been caught in the crossfire of his ambitions. Veronica, unable to contain her emotions any longer, exploded. "This is unbelievable. You expect me to just stand here and accept this? Edward, you've humiliated me in front of everyone I know. How could you keep something like this from me?" Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "What kind of man am I marrying?" Edward, visibly shaken, turned to Veronica. "I didn't know," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "I swear I didn't know. If I had," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The truth was, he didn't know what he would have done. The realization that his choices had led to this moment was almost too much to bear. Back in the hall, the triplets sat quietly, their young minds trying to make sense of what was happening. Guests continued to whisper and speculate, the once joyous atmosphere now overshadowed by tension and uncertainty. Clara eventually returned to her children, her expression calm but resolute. She knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around their small shoulders. "Everything's going to be okay," she assured them, though the path forward was far from clear. Edward, left alone with Veronica, knew he had to make a choice. His carefully constructed life had been upended, and the truth about his past could no longer be ignored. The question now was whether he would rise to the challenge and take responsibility, or let his fear and pride dictate his actions. As the wedding day descended into chaos, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The echoes of the confrontation lingered in the grand estate long after the guests began to leave, their murmurs of disbelief and scandal spreading like wildfire. Edward Langston stood on the precipice of a decision that would define not only the man he was, but the legacy he would leave behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the lavish grounds, Edward remained alone in the empty banquet hall, grappling with the weight of his choices. The glittering chandeliers above seemed to mock him, their brilliance a stark contrast to the turmoil within. Veronica St. James had left in a storm of tears and fury, her dream of a perfect wedding shattered. Her parting words, laced with venom and betrayal, echoed in Edward's mind, "You've ruined everything." This is the man I've trusted with my future? A man with secrets he didn't even know he had. Though Edward had tried to explain, to plead with her to stay and let him fix things, it was too late. Veronica's anger and humiliation had left no room for reconciliation. As she sped away in her limousine, Edward knew their relationship was over. The life he had so carefully curated was crumbling, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the hollowness of his success. Meanwhile, Clara Matthews and the triplets remained in a quieter part of the estate, waiting for Edward to make his next move. Clara, though composed, felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had done what she came to do, brought the truth to light and given Edward the opportunity to step up as a father. But as the hours passed and Edward failed to emerge from his self-imposed isolation, doubts began to creep in. Had she made a mistake in confronting him so publicly? Would Edward ever be capable of putting aside his ego and accepting the responsibilities he had long ignored? For Edward, the hours that followed were a crucible. He replayed Clara's words over and over in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. They deserve to know their father, and you deserve to know them. He thought of the triplets, their bright eyes so full of life and curiosity, and the undeniable truth of their resemblance to him. The realization that he had missed their first steps, their first words, and every milestone in between was like a punch to the gut. For all his wealth and success, Edward felt poorer than he ever had before. He had everything money could buy, but he had nothing that truly mattered. As the weight of his choices bore down on him, Edward made a decision. For years, he had defined himself by his achievements, measuring his worth by the size of his bank account and the prestige of his name. But none of that mattered now. He realized that if he continued down the path he had chosen, he would lose something far more valuable than money or reputation. He would lose the chance to be part of his children's lives. With a deep breath, Edward stood, his resolve hardening. It was time to face the consequences of his actions and make amends. Edward found Clara and the triplets in the estate's garden, where the children were playing under the soft glow of the evening lights. The sight of them, so full of joy and innocence despite the day's events, struck a chord deep within him. For a moment, he simply watched. Taking it away, James helped Amelia climb onto a bench, the way Theo laughed as he chased a butterfly. They were a living, breathing reminder of the life he had missed, and the life he still had a chance to be part of. Clara noticed Edward's approach and stood to meet him, her expression guarded but not unkind. She had spent years preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. Edward stopped a few feet away, his usual confidence replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Clara," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't even know where to start. I spent my whole life chasing success, convincing myself that it would make me happy. But standing here now, I realize I've been chasing the wrong things." Clara listened in silence, her gaze steady as Edward continued. "I can't change the past, and I'll never be able to make up for the time I've missed. But I want to try. I want to be a father to them, to James, Amelia, and Theo. If you'll let me." His words were sincere, but they carried a note of uncertainty. Edward wasn't used to asking for forgiveness, let alone admitting his mistakes. This was uncharted territory for him, and it showed. Clara studied him for a long moment before responding. "Edward," she said softly, "being a father isn't about grand gestures or empty promises. It's about showing up every single day. It's about being there for the scraped knees, the bad dreams, and the school place. It's not something you can buy or delegate. It's something you have to earn." Her words were firm but not harsh, a challenge that Edward knew he had to rise to if he wanted to be part of their lives. Over the weeks that followed, Edward set out to prove himself. He stepped back from his company, delegating responsibilities to his trusted team so he could focus on building a relationship with his children. It wasn't easy. The triplets, while curious about their father, were initially hesitant. Edward had to earn their trust, not with gifts or grand gestures, but with time, patience, and genuine effort. He attended their school events, helped with homework, and learned their favorite bedtime stories. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to crumble. Clara watched from a distance, her skepticism gradually giving way to cautious optimism. She saw a side of Edward she hadn't seen in years, the kind, compassionate man she had fallen in love with. Though their romantic relationship was long over, Clara found herself respecting Edward for his determination to do right by their children. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that he might truly change. As months turned into years, Edward's life transformed. His priorities shifted, and he found a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. His bond with James, Amelia, and Theo grew stronger with each passing day, and he became an integral part of their lives. Though the path had been difficult, Edward had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not wealth, not status, but a sense of purpose and connection. In the end, the wedding that was meant to showcase Edward's success became the turning point that redefined his life. The man who had once measured his worth by his achievements learned that true success wasn't about what he had, but about who he was to the people who mattered most. And as he stood with his children and Clara at a family gathering years later, surrounded by laughter and love, Edward finally understood what it meant to be rich in the ways that truly mattered.